All right. It is so good to see all of you this morning on this Labor Day Sunday. And I hope you're getting a little bit of a break from the routine this weekend. So what do you do? How many times have you been asked that question when you meet somebody at a party or a social gathering? How many times do you think you've asked someone that question? So what do you do? This may be a little bit less prevalent in Portland or the Pacific Northwest than in many parts of the country, but as someone who came from the East Coast, I can tell you that you almost never get out of a new social interaction with someone without exchanging this apparently vital statistic. To know someone is to know what they do, or more specifically, what they do for a living. In American society, our work defines us to a greater degree than it does in many other cultures. I once heard the difference between the United States culture and Latin American culture described this way. In the United States, we live to work, whereas in Latin America, people work in order to live. In other words, North Americans often live for our work, while South Americans work in service to their life outside work with their family and their friends. That's a stereotype, perhaps, a stereotype that Oregonians may conform to less than many other folks in the US, but there's some truth to it. Most of us have been socialized to tie our sense of worth, our status, to the work we do in the market for pay. It's the American way. Strive, succeed, and be measured by your position and your portfolio. There's just 3 problems with this American way, this myth in our society. First, we don't start from a level playing field. Second, it doesn't really end up making us happy. And third, it's not consistent with the faith we profess as Christians. Well, let's take these one at a time. Americans, or at least white Americans, love to promote the perhaps uniquely American myth that everyone starts from the same place in this race that we call life, that everyone benefits from a level playing field. It's incredible that we have managed to sustain this myth as a dominant culture in the face of so much evidence to the contrary. But in the era of alternative facts and fake news, maybe nothing should surprise us anymore. Well, despite the fact that African Americans spent the first 200 years of their existence in this country in chains, and despite the fact that women were denied access to most professions until the mid-20th century and still earn only 81 cents to every dollar earned by their male counterparts. And despite the fact that Native Americans were dispossessed of their lands and livelihoods and herded onto small reservations, we are supposed to believe somehow that racism and sexism now magically only exist in pockets and maybe are practiced by a few bad apples, rather than being a systemic and structural reality that distort people's chances in life from birth. That's not even to mention the structural differential in access to education and healthcare and other factors that divide rural and urban communities, white communities, and working class versus affluent neighborhoods. But somehow this myth persists, and of course, a lot of people pay a lot of money to help this myth persist, that the highly paid white accountant, for example, works harder and thus deserves more money and status in our society than the Black caregiver who works 24/7 in the elderly person's home. Well, as the therapist or addiction counselor might ask, how's that working out for you? Is this myth that we can achieve the American dream by pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps really working for us? Are we, I would ask, a happier and more peaceful society for it? Recent events might suggest otherwise. In fact, a UN study that ranks quality of life in countries, known as the World Happiness Index, shows that the US has been steadily declining in overall happiness or quality of life since 2012. Unfortunately, that has come with a rise in depression and other forms of mental illness, addictions, suicide, and other factors indicating social distress. In fact, we're now sitting at 18th in the world rankings, below almost all other developed countries and Costa Rica. And now we've gotten to the point where almost everyone is mad at everyone else. White folks are mad at people of color for daring to demand equal treatment and equal access to things like justice, police protection, education, and jobs. In other words, for taking some of our cookies away that we white folks feel like we've earned. Black folks are mad at white folks for killing them, which actually strikes me as a much more compelling rationale for rage than the impact of affirmative action, for example, on white folks in education and the workplace. Well, in reality, measuring ourselves by our portfolios and our positions only works as long as you're on top of the wheel of fortune. It doesn't work as well when illness or disability or COVID or market forces knocks you off the wheel. And I think that accounts for some of the rage that many whites in our society are feeling today, especially white men who have been socialized and ingrained to measure their worth by their outward achievements. But then they find avenues to that achievement blocked. And let's be clear here, those avenues to achievement are not by and large being blocked by uppity people of color, as they are often led to believe, but by global market forces and poor policy frameworks in the United States. But it affects everyone, including women, including our entire society. When we find ourselves unemployed or underemployed or slotted into work that fits our demographic maybe in our society, but doesn't truly fit our gifts or our abilities, we end up feeling ashamed often, even though it has absolutely nothing to do with personal failure or lack of effort on our part. And here's just a little window into that reality that I've had recently. You know, for most of my life, except for when I've been a student and with just a few small gaps, I've always been employed. Maybe a lot of you could say the same thing. Well, it's interesting because just lately I've been noticing that whenever I go to a doctor's appointment, or recently I applied for long-term care insurance, things like that, you have to check off this box, don't you, that says whether you're employed or not, and who your employer is. You with me? And when you check off that box and you write in your employer, it feels kind of good, like you belong somewhere. You have work in the world. You are a productive citizen. And the only reason I notice that is because I'm planning to take some time off work. I mean, this is a planned thing. I have chosen not to look for employment immediately following my interim. I am deciding to take some time for my family, for my grieving process, for settling my mom's affairs. And I'm looking forward to that. But I have this little feeling when I have to fill out that form that I'm going to feel just a little embarrassed. A little embarrassed. I mean, I don't look over 65. I hope, not yet. I'll get there. But I might be a little embarrassed to fill out the part that says, yeah, I'm unemployed. I mean, I feel like I'm going to want to write a note, well, actually, I've been very gainfully employed for very many years. And in fact, I'm a pastor and I have these degrees and I'm just taking a little time off to work, on my mom's affairs and it's like I have to explain myself. And I'm not even being laid off. This is all an intentional transition. It's hard. It goes to how deeply we measure ourselves by our work in our culture and by the title associated with it and the dollar sign that it earns. Well, the final problem, of course, with this American myth of upward mobility from a level playing field, because supposedly we all start with the same chances in life, this is, of course, completely inconsistent, not only with the reality that we live, but also with the gospel, with our faith tradition. We live by a gospel that is subversive, actively subversive to this American myth. And in fact, you might say everybody and every culture lives by some narrative of salvation, some salvation story. What gives your life work? What redeems you as a human being, makes you a valuable person? And it's not necessarily, in many cases, the salvation story that our faith tradition tells. Often it's one that goes counter to it. And so we've been talking about the uniquely American gospel, that in a sense we are saved by what we do, our belongingness, our worth, our value, literally in society's eyes, is charted according to our work. But that's not the only secular gospel narrative. There's other narratives in other countries that have more to do with caste or inheritance, where we fall in a deeply embedded class or caste structure. But when we look at the gospel of Jesus, we see why it is so deeply subversive of other cultural salvation narratives, and why, in fact, if we can recapture the spirit of that salvation narrative, of that good news, we can actually be liberated. And we can see why the first Christians, the first hearers of that gospel, were so excited and energized by it. So let's look for a moment at our text from Ephesians 2. You are saved, this writer says, by God's grace. You are saved by God's grace. You could have just put a period right there. The writer continues, because of your faith. Our faith, our eyes of faith, our lens is what of seeing the grace of God allows us to receive it, to participate in it. But it really is all God's doing. That's what the writer means by saying this salvation is God's gift. It's not something you possessed. It's not something you did. you can be proud of. And by the way, I love this Common English Bible version. I think it's a little more accessible than the standard one that we read. But instead, we are God's accomplishment, Ephesians says. We are created in Christ Jesus to do good things. God planned for these good things to be the way we live our lives. In other words, we don't take pride in our accomplishments. We find our pride, or we find our worth, our value in what God has done for us, which is from the beginning to make us God's beloved child, a belovedness and a belongingness that can never be taken away from us. Whether we check the box that says employed or unemployed or retired or black or white or male or female or other, right? So we're saved. We experience our deep worth and belongingness, not because of what we do, but because of who we are, and we are God's. But out of that, we are energized to do good things. God gives us gifts and abilities and invites us, calls us to use them in the world. Well, if we can realize and claim this giftedness, this grace from God, that we are loved deeply just for who we have been created to be, not for anything we do or any title or degree around our name, then we can be liberated, truly experience a sense of liberation from bondage to social codes and status shaming. We can be free to consider the possibility that we might choose to work not to secure our sense of worth or the right to take up space in the world, which is sometimes how it feels to me, to be honest with you. Like, if I'm not doing good work in the world, then what right do I have to take up space in the world? But what if we were set free to live our best possible life? The life to which God is calling us, our true vocation. Maybe that means we make a mid-career shift, as some of us have done, to follow our bliss, as Joseph Campbell encouraged us to do. Or if our economic circumstances allow, we might be free to set aside paid work or career ladder climbing and embrace caring for our children or our elderly parents in the home as a vocation. Or we might choose to volunteer our time in the causes that mean the most to us. Perhaps if we can't do that entirely, we might take a less high-paying job that demands less of us in order to expend more of our time and energy in the things that matter most for us. Now, of course, we are also free to pursue finding our highest and best meaning and purpose within the work that we're paid to do. But it can be liberating to know that, as Nifsi said in our modern testimony, our vocation is less about the particular things we do and more about the spirit with which we do them. So I think then a question that we might reflect on for Labor Sunday is, where do we find our highest and best purpose? Where do we find our calling, our sense of vocation? Is it in the work that we do for pay, if we have work for pay? Or is it perhaps in the work we do in our home or in our volunteer work? Or is it some combination of all of those things? And as Nifsi says, if it's less about the particular things we do and more about who we are, our vocation as a revelation of our true selves in the world. And if it is less about what we do than the spirit with which we do them, it kind of puts this wonderful and famous Micah 6:8 verse in context. For Micah 6:8, that ringing clarion call to understand what God truly wants from humanity and from each one of us. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does God require of you but this? To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. If this is truly our calling, then what matters the most to God is not any particular job that we do, but how we do it, the character that we bring to our work. We can find avenues to do justice, to treat one another with compassion and kindness, empathy and respect, and to live with a sense of humility, not entitlement. We can do that in any work. I have found that some of the most noble and spiritually gifted individuals have been in work that has the least status in our society. There's one custodian that I remember with particular fondness and joy when I think about my time in Salem. A man who came to us applying for the custodian position at First UCC in Salem. And he was a remarkable individual. He had a criminal record. He had been an addict, and as an addict, he had committed a crime. And that crime had landed him in jail for a while, but he had an extraordinary transformative story, truly of redemption, of coming out of his addiction and turning his life around. And he became such a light in that Salem community. He opened his house literally to homeless neighbors. He developed a homeless ministry out of his home. He was serving in so many beautiful ways in the community. And when he came and applied for the job, it was a no-brainer that he was going to be a beautiful fit for us. But what I wasn't expecting was the seriousness and sense of vocation that he brought to his work as a custodian. He loved that job, and he took it very seriously, that it was a ministry of hospitality to every single person that came into our building, whether they were homeless and at the door for a pair of the clean socks or the bag lunch that we would hand out, or whether it was one of our members looking for some help to get something set up for a meeting, whether it was the staff. He served the community with such gladness. I saw within him the light of Christ. And I can tell you that was of far greater value to me than some of the people that I have encountered that have served in much higher paying professions with much greater respect in our society at large. So in closing, I would invite you on this Labor Day weekend to spend just a little time, maybe in some meditation or some prayer, maybe some journaling, about what good work means to you. What work are you feeling called to do in the world? There's a phrase that I was thinking of when I came up with the title for this sermon, Good Work. And it's that phrase that you often hear activists use about doing the work. And when somebody says you're doing the work, they're not talking about your job. They're talking about the work of Micah 6:8, the work of building the beloved community, the work of reconciliation and peacemaking and justice building. That is the work. It's the work to which we are all called, and we can do it anywhere, anytime, within any job or any work, paid or unpaid. Are you happy with your work? What is your highest and best purpose in life? As we continue through the service and into the coffee hour, I would invite you to feel free to share any thoughts or feelings or inspirations that this has brought up within you in the chat, or perhaps a coffee hour. Journal about it, reflect on it, talk to your spouse. What is the work to which you have been uniquely called? Amen.